Mid-August 2005. People across the Gulf Coast of the United States were enjoying the end of the summer holiday. Schools would be coming back in session across portions of the country come early September, and tourists flooded the streets, attracted to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Locals had little to worry about, living day to day as usual. Little did those tourists and the locals know that come the beginning of September, everything would change, with scars etched into the coasts of Mississippi and Louisiana that last to this day. In late August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina brought its wrath to the Florida Peninsula and to the Gulf coasts of Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, suffering the worst of the storm. Hurricane Katrina's toll on the coasts of Mississippi and Louisiana was beyond comprehension, with nothing but pure devastation observed in Mississippi, but New Orleans, to put it lightly, saw the absolute worst of the damage. The levee system in New Orleans failed, leading to 80% of the city being submerged underwater. The government response to Katrina after the fact is considered to be the worst government response to a natural disaster in U.S. history. Hurricane Katrina has garnered a reputation for being the most infamous hurricane in U.S. history, and it's obvious as to why. I mean, it's far and away the most expensive hurricane in U.S. history, tied with Hurricane Harvey of 2017. Everybody knows about Hurricane Katrina and are already aware of what I just told you. But today, I want to look deeper into Hurricane Katrina, looking deeper into how the meteorological development of Hurricane Katrina occurred and how the response failed. So today, I will be taking a deep dive into Hurricane Katrina, going over the state of the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season thus far, the origins, the forecast, the preparations taken, the storm's impacts on the areas it traveled across, the aftermath and a failed response to Hurricane Katrina from the government, and the legacy that the storm has. Welcome to Nature's Fury. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season was already extremely active by the time Katrina formed. To be fair, the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season would end up going down as the most active year for tropical cyclones in the northern Atlantic until 2020, at least in terms of named storms. Before Katrina formed, there were 10 named storms plus one unnamed depression that formed in the Atlantic basin, 2 of those being major hurricanes. The first major hurricane of the season was Hurricane Dennis, a high-end Category 4 hurricane that slammed into Cuba and the Gulf Coast of the United States. While Dennis did weaken before its landfall in the United States, Hurricane Dennis's impacts to Cuba and the United States led the storm to be retired. The second major storm was Hurricane Emily, the earliest Category 5 hurricane during the calendar year in the Atlantic Basin, peaking in the Caribbean Sea before making landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula as a Category 4 hurricane. The hurricane emerged off the coast of Mexico and made a second landfall as a Category 3 hurricane near San Fernando, Mexico. To this day, Hurricane Emily remains one of very few Category 5 hurricanes to not have its name retired. From then on, the Atlantic Ocean continued to churn out tropical cyclones, but none were major. But of course, coming into mid to late August, another tropical system would begin to organize off the coast of Florida, and would be given a name that would go down in infamy. But real quick, only a small portion of the people who like these weather documentaries are subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content I create, consider subscribing. It helps support what I do and tells me I'm doing something right. Also, I have a Discord server that I frequently talk in, link to that is in the description. Anyways, back to Hurricane Katrina. Katrina's origins as a tropical system were more complex than most tropical cyclones that form in the northern Atlantic. Katrina's formation was the result of the interactions of a tropical wave, the mid-level remnants of Tropical Depression 10, and an upper-level trough. On August 11th, a tropical wave exited the coast of Africa and moved through the main development region of the Atlantic Ocean over the next few days. While the wave was crossing across the MDR, on August 14th, a strong upper-level trough located across the western Atlantic and the Bahamas created strong westerly shear across Tropical Depression 10, causing it to dissipate. The low-level circulation, however, persisted, moving westward while gradually weakening before dissipating near Cuba on August 21st. The mid-level circulation that originated from Tropical Depression 10 lagged behind the low-level circulation. Eventually, the mid-level circulation merged with the tropical wave that left the coast of Africa. The wave proceeded to produce a large area of showers and thunderstorms north of Puerto Rico, moving towards the northwest before consolidating east of the Turks and Caicos Islands. At the same time, the upper-level trough began to weaken as it moved westward into Florida, allowing for the tropical wave to develop due to the lack of wind shear associated with the trough. By 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 23rd, the system was designated as Tropical Depression 12. During the overnight hours, the depression became better organized, and at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 24th, the depression was upgraded to a tropical storm and given the name Katrina. As Katrina developed off the coast of Florida, Katrina came under the influence of a strengthening mid to upper level ridge over the northern Gulf of Mexico and southern United States. This ridge would be responsible for turning Katrina westward, and that was represented well in the forecasts. The National Hurricane Center predicted that Katrina would move over the southern Florida peninsula at a slow pace, projected to make landfall as a Category 1 hurricane and cross over into the Gulf of Mexico. As to what was expected once it went into the Gulf of Mexico, that was uncertain. Original forecasts called for a landfall ranging from the western coasts of the Florida peninsula all the way into portions of Alabama. Long-term forecasts were uncertain, but in the short term, the threat was for Florida. As Katrina turned westward, tropical storm watches and warnings and hurricane warnings were issued for the Florida coastline. In advance of the storm's landfall, Florida Governor Jeb Bush issued a state of emergency on August 24th, with Florida's Emergency Operations Center being activated in Tallahassee. Schools and businesses began closing in the Miami metro area. Cruise ships altered their paths due to the seaports in Florida closing, and airports across southern Florida were closed. Residents in Florida began stocking up on supplies, and gas shortages were an expected issue across Florida due to limited supply. Evacuation orders were issued across portions of Florida, and emergency shelters were opened in preparation for Katrina. Preparations were quick due to how close Katrina was to the coast of Florida by the time warnings were issued, and it was only a matter of time before Katrina would land its first punch. While Katrina was turning towards the Florida coastline, the storm was already bringing impacts to portions of the Bahamas. Thankfully, the Bahamas had minimal impacts from Katrina. Before landfall, Katrina strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane, making landfall around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in southern Florida with winds of 80 miles per hour. The storm had an asymmetrical structure as it came ashore, with the heaviest rain and the strongest winds occurring to the south and east of the center. However, what Katrina is mostly remembered for in Florida was the severe flooding that occurred. Due to the asymmetrical structure of Katrina and the slow movement of the storm, flooding became an issue in far southern Florida. In extreme southern Florida, rainfall totals were in excess of 5 inches, with some areas seeing over 10 inches of rainfall. The maximum rainfall observed in Florida was in Perrine, Florida, with a total of 16.43 inches of rainfall falling due to Katrina in the city. A total of 14 deaths occurred in Florida. Of those, 6 were directly due to flooding, and the other 8 were indirect deaths. As Katrina moved across the Florida peninsula and into the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina weakened down to a bare minimum Category 1 hurricane with winds of 75 miles per hour. The storm continued to become more organized, gradually strengthening after moving over the Florida Keys. Its strengthening was limited, however, due to Katrina undergoing an eyewall replacement cycle. As Katrina continued moving towards the west-southwest, the National Hurricane Center realized that Katrina was not going to aim for the Florida Panhandle. What they began to suspect was a landfall a bit further to the west than that, somewhere along the Louisiana and Alabama Gulf coasts, putting the city of New Orleans directly in its path. Shortly after the forecast was adjusted, Katrina would complete its eyewall replacement cycle, and would explode in intensity, rapidly intensifying from a Category 3 hurricane to a 175-mile-per-hour Category 5 hurricane, and in its crosshairs was New Orleans, Louisiana. Regardless of Katrina's strength at landfall, governments at all levels knew evacuations had to begin with the utmost urgency, and in some cases, should have already been underway. However, it was abundantly clear in the days that followed that there was a major discrepancy between what officials said and what they actually did in preparation for the disaster which was approaching fast. Frankly, to call it a dumpster fire would be giving officials too much credit for their work, which we will see very shortly. The response to Hurricane Katrina, both in preparations and during the aftermath, is often referred to as the worst government response to a natural disaster in US history. That is an understatement, but it's during this segment where I want to go more in depth with what went wrong during preparations, what went right, and the glaring problem that was staring New Orleans right in the face, the levee system. Let's begin with a timeline of events. After Katrina strengthened to a Category 3 hurricane, President George W. Bush declared a state of emergency in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi ahead of Katrina. According to the congressional report from the bipartisan committee established to investigate the government's response to Hurricane Katrina, preparations in Mississippi went rather well, at least in comparison to what occurred in Louisiana. Months leading up to the storm, county and state officials were prepared and underwent disaster response training. Ahead of Katrina, Mississippi established command structures by way of emergency proclamations, activated emergency operations centers, issued mandatory evacuation orders, opened emergency shelters, and mobilized the National Guard. Evacuations were the top priority, with the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency prioritizing evacuating the coastline before opening shelters, which they eventually did. Mississippi began monitoring Katrina as early as August 23rd, and emergency declarations and troops were deployed on August 26th. Alabama's response for Katrina was also, comparatively speaking, relatively smooth. Of course, after being battered with Hurricane Ivan the year previously, Alabama Emergency Management finalized preparations 4 days before landfall, issuing states of emergencies for the coastal counties. Basically, what happened in Mississippi in advance of Katrina also applied to Alabama, with Alabama also learning from their mistakes in communications because of Hurricanes Ivan and Dennis. Louisiana, being in the direct path of the storm, began commencing with their evacuation plan, with the Department of Transportation and the Louisiana State Police implementing contraflow, making all highway lanes outbound to maximize traffic flow, with the contraflow directing those evacuating into Texas and Mississippi. On the 27th, the National Guard began to be deployed across southeastern Louisiana, and up to 1.2 million Louisiana residents followed the evacuation orders. With Hurricane Katrina expected to make landfall as a Category 4 or 5 hurricane, many who could evacuate ahead of the storm did so. Storm surge was a prominent issue, with storm surge expected to be over 20 feet, which would overtop the levees and flood New Orleans. The levee system collapsing was not a major concern at the time. Very few truly expected the complete collapse of the levee system. Although, the warning signs of what was about to occur was in full display, but I'll get to that later. That all being said, thousands of residents, specifically in New Orleans, stayed in their homes. But why did many people remain where they were? There's a multitude of reasons, but let's go over the less significant reasons first and go from there. The first issue was the type of evacuation orders that were issued initially. Parishes in Louisiana began declaring evacuation orders as early as August 27th at 9 a.m., specifically beginning with the southernmost parishes, then moving northward to prevent traffic bottlenecks. However, the type of evacuation orders initially issued were not mandatory, but rather recommendatory. Eventually, the evacuation orders were upgraded to mandatory, but this caused some issues with messaging. The second issue was that Governor Blanco did not issue a state of emergency, but rather relied on the federal state of emergency declaration. The decision to not issue a local state of emergency meant that there was conflicting messaging regarding what to do ahead of Katrina and afterwards. However, the biggest issues with the preparations in Louisiana came out of New Orleans. In New Orleans, the mandatory evacuation order was issued extremely late, with Mayor Ray Nagin issuing a mandatory evacuation of the city only 20 hours before landfall. Critics argue that he should have issued it earlier, but at least it was declared. The city of New Orleans established several refuges of last resort for citizens, most notably the Superdome. Now, to be clear, 80% of the New Orleans metro area evacuated ahead of Katrina, but the issues with the preparations in Louisiana wasn't related to those who had the ability to evacuate, but rather the inaction done to help those who could not evacuate on their own. While most of New Orleans was able to evacuate, the evacuation plans did not benefit those who had the inability to evacuate on their own, specifically those in poverty, hospitals, and long-term caring facilities. People in those locations have to rely on outside help, whether that be the government, medical companies, or local groups in order to evacuate to a safer location. However, actions that could have been taken to help evacuate those who are most vulnerable to a storm like Katrina were not done. Long-term care facilities attempted to get in contact with buses and ambulances to get patients out, but many of those companies were unable to evacuate the residents. Fuel was in short supply, and many forms of public transportation were shut down before Katrina came ashore. But the most neglected populace of the New Orleans metro was those below the poverty line, specifically in the lower 9th Ward. Within Louisiana's Emergency Operations Plan Supplement 1C in Part 2, Section 2, Paragraph D, the plan calls for the use of school buses and other public buses to evacuate those who cannot evacuate on their own. While there were buses publicly available to use to help people evacuate outside of the city or to emergency shelters, there was still a major problem. There weren't enough bus drivers. The issue of the lack of bus drivers could have been circumvented if the governor of Louisiana signed an emergency waiver that would declare that any licensed driver could drive a public bus to help aid with evacuation efforts. Governor Blanco did not sign that waiver, meaning that those in poverty, long-term care facilities, and hospitals were left with little to no assistance from the local governments, leaving them to fend for themselves. For those who stayed, they stocked up on supplies if they could, hoping for the best. However, the true worst-case scenario of the levee system breaking down was not a common concern for those in the path who weren't government officials. But the potential for the levee system breaking down almost completely was very real, and the issues surrounding the levee system were not very well known to residents until after the system had failed. In order to understand how catastrophic the failure of the levee system was, we need to understand the abhorrent conditions of the levee system itself during its construction to understand what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. The New Orleans levee system began construction at least 35 years before Katrina struck, and in order to understand how it failed, we have to understand the mistakes and shortcuts taken during its construction. From there, it will become blatantly obvious why it ended up collapsing during Hurricane Katrina. There's a lot of engineering jargon in the ASCE report on the levee system from 2007, but I will try and simplify it the best I can. It's well known that the levee system was poorly constructed, but I cannot say it enough. The report itself establishes that the state of the levee system was far worse than what's commonly known. The New Orleans levee system, officially known as the New Orleans Hurricane Protection System, is made up of 3 main units: the Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project, the West Bank and Vicinity New Orleans, Louisiana Hurricane Protection Project, and the New Orleans to Venice, Louisiana Hurricane Protection Project. The protection projects consisted of 3 types of levees: earthen levees, which was most of the system, eye walls, and T-walls. You don't really need to know much about how they work entirely, you just need to know that the eye walls and T-walls were the ones that failed the most. In concept, relatively simple and easy to construct, from an engineering standpoint at least. However, as the ASCE report states, a multitude of problems surrounded the levee system's construction and maintenance, and let's take this issue by issue, starting with the funding and issues that come with it. The one in control of the funding of the majority of levee systems across the United States is the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the USACE for short. The USACE is, by all accounts, a bureaucratic agency under the Department of Defense. The USACE's position as a bureaucratic agency means that the budget the agency has changes each year because Congress is in charge of the federal budget every year. It is not consistent, and because bureaucracy, funding for projects done by the USACE has to be split up into multiple smaller projects. This applied to the New Orleans levee system. The system wasn't really a system, but a bunch of separate parts that varied in construction quality and maintenance, built in a piecemeal fashion. What this ultimately meant is that the weak levees that, for all intents and purposes, would fail were placed next to stronger levees which would normally not be susceptible to failure. Because of how the levees varied in size and height in such close proximity to each other, essentially, The strong levees were pointless as they would be overtaken due to floodwaters that overtopped the weaker levees. Not to mention that due to this funding system, portions of the levee system weren't built or even complete by the time Katrina hit. Remember, anything is only as strong as its weakest part. Just from the funding issue alone in the piecemeal structure, it would surprise no one how the levee system failed. And yet, it somehow gets worse. When constructing the levee system, many safety protocols that should have been taken in order to maximize safety were ignored. This all begins with the data that was used to construct the system. When building the levee systems, the USACE was given numbers from the National Weather Service of what a standard hurricane that would hit New Orleans would be like. The initial numbers of a high-end hurricane that was used to design the levee systems was 101 to 111 miles per hour. The standard hurricane data came from 1959. The National Weather Service revised their numbers of what the worst-case scenario of a hurricane in New Orleans would be, in order to design the levee system with the worst-case scenario in mind. Despite the new numbers, the USACE did not use those new numbers and designed the system with the old numbers in mind. The levee system was designed with a Category 2 hurricane in mind, not the worst-case scenario. But wait, there's more. The levee system as a whole did not take into account that the city of New Orleans was subsiding at a rate of roughly a fifth of an inch a year. So instead of the levees being adjusted for that rate, the levees just subsided alongside the city. On top of that, erosion of the levees wasn't taken into account either. No measures were taken to limit or prevent the erosion of the levees, and the mean sea level data that was used incorrectly, leading to levees being 1 to 2 feet below what they should have been, and water gaps that formed behind the eye walls were not taken into account by engineers when constructing the levee system. There also was no single agency in charge of overseeing the levee system, nor was there any serious external review of the levee system to make sure it was maintained properly. So, in summary, the levee system of New Orleans was not much a system, but more so a hodgepodge of several small parts that were poorly glued together and constructed without taking into account very important factors in order to maximize the safety of New Orleans, leading to a levee system which was meant to be a protector of the city, being the equivalent of a ticking time bomb. It was only a matter of time before the levee system's flaws would be exposed greatly in the worst way possible. That storm was Katrina. And if it wasn't Katrina, it very likely would have been something else. So, with the preparations of the levee system covered, it was only a matter of time before Katrina would turn towards the Louisiana coast. And in the process, it would become one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. After Hurricane Katrina completed its eyewall replacement cycle off the coast of the Florida Keys, Hurricane Katrina began to become better organized, and more symmetrical, expanding in size to become a massive hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Due to a lack of wind shear and extremely warm sea surface temperatures, Katrina rapidly intensified from a Category 3 hurricane to a Category 5 monster, peaking in intensity and strength south of the Louisiana coast on August 28th. Hurricane Katrina peaked with winds of 175 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 902 millibars, one of the lowest pressures ever recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. But from space, Katrina's presentation was the classic hurricane that many think of. An almost perfectly symmetrical hurricane, massive in size, a mesmerizing terror that was about to crash into the coast of the United States. As Katrina turned northward under the influence of the ridge that steered it into Florida, Katrina underwent another eyewall replacement cycle. Due to the eyewall replacement cycle, lower sea surface temperatures, increased wind shear, and dry air being injected near the center of circulation, Katrina began to weaken up until landfall. Its pressure, on the other hand, remained extremely low. Despite the degrading structure, Katrina was a force to be reckoned with. Many went to sleep on August 28th hoping for the best and expecting the worst. But what many expected to be the worst-case scenario was far, far better than what actually happened across the Gulf Coast the next morning. In the early morning hours of the 29th, many across Louisiana were waking up to what could only be described as a cataclysm descending onto their homes. Katrina was coming in during high tide, and due to Katrina's low pressure of 920 millibars, tides were already 3 feet above normal. Storm surge ranged across the Louisiana coast, with many areas seeing storm surge in excess of 10 feet, peaking in 20 feet in Louisiana. Much of the New Orleans area was already seeing storm surge of 10 to 15 feet batter against the levee system. The mean water level rose to over 20 feet across the New Orleans area. The levee systems were struggling even before the eyewall came anywhere close to the city. Shortly after 6 a.m., Hurricane Katrina made landfall to the southeast of New Orleans as a Category 3 hurricane. But during this time, the levee system was already failing. The Industrial Canal East Bank North Eyewall was the first to fail, with water rushing into the lower 9th Ward around 5 a.m. At 6:30 a.m., a section of the eyewall along the east side of the 17th Street Canal failed. Then sometime between 6 and 7 a.m., the southern portion of the London Avenue Canal levee failed. Then, the northern portion of the canal. Like dominoes toppling one after another, levee after levee failed, with a total of 53 levees in the New Orleans area being breached during Katrina. The levee system collapsed, leading to what could only be described as walls of water rushing into the city. The water submerged houses in as fast as a couple minutes, at rates of nearly a foot a minute. The water in New Orleans would only continue to rise, only stopping when the water in New Orleans became equal to the water level in Lake Pontchartrain. But New Orleans was only one location affected, because the next target for Hurricane Katrina was the Mississippi coastline. After Katrina made landfall in Louisiana, Katrina made its final landfall near the Mississippi-Louisiana state line as a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 120 miles per hour. Mississippi, being in the northeast quadrant, suffered the worst from Katrina, experiencing storm surge of 27 feet, going 6 miles inland, leveling beachfront neighborhoods, wiping houses off of their foundations, with preliminary estimates calculating that 90% of structures within half a mile of the coast was completely destroyed. Hurricane Katrina's landfall in the state of Mississippi was the strongest landfall in the state in terms of pressure since Hurricane Camille, and many residents would soon find out that Katrina was on par, if not worse in some areas of Mississippi, than what they experienced during Camille. Hurricane Katrina beelined nearly due north, weakening as it traveled north into Mississippi, with every county in the state experiencing Katrina's wrath. While Katrina weakened, Katrina brought a noticeable flooding threat to the southeastern United States through the Ohio River Valley and into Canada. Many areas received at least an inch of rain, with localized areas of over 5 inches of rainfall across most of Mississippi, portions of Kentucky, and the Appalachian Mountains. Storm surge was also a threat to the Alabama and Florida coastlines, with storm surge ranging from 14 to 16 feet in Alabama, leveling houses and leading to over 500,000 people losing power in the state of Alabama, one of the largest power outages in the state's history. However, as the storm passed over Louisiana and Mississippi, people struggled to even comprehend the devastation that surrounded them. It would take a while for some, but to all, the result was readily apparent. They were witnesses to what is arguably the worst aftermath from a hurricane in the continental United States in recorded history. Most of this segment is dedicated to the New Orleans area because that's what people remember, but I do want to briefly mention what happened in Mississippi first. The damage in Mississippi was the worst damage observed from a hurricane in the state since Hurricane Camille. Many communities, specifically near Biloxi and Gulfport, Mississippi, were swept from existence, with houses along the coast being slabbed. Most of the damage was visible after the storm passed, with many residents coming back to see nothing but pure destruction. Katrina's storm surge of 27 feet was the largest storm surge ever recorded in the United States since records have been kept. Many areas were inundated, and the storm surge was responsible for the majority of the damage in Mississippi. However, the majority of focus was what was going on in New Orleans, in what is referred to as the worst response to a natural disaster from the United States government, on the local, state, and federal levels. As the clouds began to lighten and the sky began to become clear. Those who stayed behind, either because they wanted to or they were forced to, by forces beyond their control, began to truly realize the predicament that they were in. Water was everywhere, and only continued to rise as water poured through the broken levees. New Orleans was stranded, with residents climbing onto rooftops, hoping that relief would come fast. Residents were at the mercy of the dangerous floodwaters, with limited supplies that they had when preparing for the storm, alongside supplies given to shelters by FEMA and local agencies, and the sweltering summer heat that plagued the New Orleans area. Local agencies, such as the New Orleans Fire and Police Departments, were submerged underwater, and communications were completely down in New Orleans, meaning that even contacting local officials was nearly impossible. But the biggest problem came down to the lack of a plan of what to do in a situation like this. Of course, the worst-case scenario was that the levee system would collapse in New Orleans. But according to former FEMA Director Michael Brown, who was the director of FEMA during Katrina, testified to Congress that regarding that when it came to the response to the disaster in New Orleans due to Katrina, there was no plan. The fault of Hurricane Katrina's disastrous response from the government cannot be solely put on a singular part of the United States government, but rather, the disaster was caused by failures on all levels of the government. As conditions became suitable for search and rescue, the United States Coast Guard rushed towards New Orleans to begin rescue efforts. Outside of Camp Shelby, a day before Katrina made landfall, Joint Task Force Katrina was established, acting as an on-scene response to the destruction caused due to Katrina. Over 50,000 national troop personnel, with troops coming from all 50 states, came in to help with the relief efforts. All of these efforts were taken to undergo the largest search and rescue mission in the United States due to a natural disaster in U.S. history. The day after Katrina's landfall, looting and violence began in New Orleans due to limited supply of resources. People were fighting to stay alive. Search and rescue operations were halted, as now local officials had to focus on stopping the violence. The biggest priority was to establish order so that rescue operations could continue as normal. By the end of the day, 80% of New Orleans would be underwater. That evening, Governor Blanco ordered the complete evacuation of the Superdome, which is surrounded by water, and sustained severe damage during Katrina. The same day, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, declared that the federal government would take over all operations regarding the recovery efforts after Katrina, citing the National Response Plan. The local and state governments, and even the federal government, due to a lack of proper planning and communication, led to a horrific response that was observed in the aftermath of Katrina. However, Governor Blanco resisted, stating that the National Guard of Louisiana could handle the situation on their own. They could not. Blanco's resistance led to further delays in the recovery effort in New Orleans. Due to the sheer scope of the situation at hand, it would take multiple days to evacuate the entirety of New Orleans and the areas that desperately needed assistance. And yet, images of people stranded on rooftops plagued the news, and it quickly became obvious that everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. Fighting between Governor Blanco and the federal government only exacerbated issues, as Blanco and her staff were incapable of organizing a coherent state effort. There was nobody truly in control until the White House stood in and assumed control of the situation. The week following Katrina's landfall could only be described as a week of hell. Days passed by as the search and rescue missions continued. Supplies were dwindling, and water was not expected to recede until weeks after Katrina dissipated. Due to the sheer scale of the devastation in New Orleans, the relief that was provided was too much for any single governmental agency to handle. Agencies like FEMA were able to get relief to some locals, but many were left in the dark, stranded, abandoned by the system that was supposed to be there to help them get back to where they were before Katrina. FEMA as an agency was already in shambles after being combined with other agencies to form the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. But after Katrina, scrutiny against FEMA led to Congress taking measures to make sure that what happened after Hurricane Katrina specifically in regards to how FEMA as an agency worked, never happened again. But as we all know, that really hasn't worked as shown by Hurricane Maria, but that's a different story for a different time. Assistance came in from other states, nonprofits such as the Red Cross, and internationally. But the support they gave, no matter how much they wanted to give, was too little given the devastation in front of them. The lack of planning and communications between all levels of government led to the deaths of hundreds. The flooding caused in New Orleans due to the failure of the levee system caused 2/3 of the flooding deaths in the city. Bodies were floating on the floodwaters, and even when the water cleared, the decomposing bodies of hundreds of residents littered the streets of New Orleans. The scope of the damage in Louisiana was beyond comprehension. Houses were completely ruined, covered in mold, and suffered losses that were beyond repair. The flooding caused by the failure of the levee system led to numerous residents with nothing, with areas being abandoned completely due to the damage left behind from Katrina. The economic impacts were devastating, as now New Orleans ports were inoperable, and 30 oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Gulf states were destroyed or damaged, leading to gasoline being scarce in portions of the country. The effects on the economy were beyond belief, with the total economic impact in Louisiana and Mississippi due to Katrina initially estimated to be over $100 billion. Across its path of destruction from Florida through the Gulf Coast and beyond, Hurricane Katrina was responsible for the deaths of approximately 1,833 people. Katrina became one of the deadliest hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. Katrina caused $125 billion in damages, making it tied with Hurricane Harvey as the costliest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin and in the world. In 2006, to absolutely nobody's surprise, the name Katrina was retired by the World Meteorological Organization and replaced with the name Katia. Hurricane Katrina is considered to be one of, if not the most infamous hurricane in United States history, and for good reason. Hurricane Katrina's reputation for what it did in New Orleans, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, alongside the localized flooding it caused and the horrendous response to the aftermath from all levels of government, gives Hurricane Katrina the reputation it has today. And yet, even though nearly 20 years have passed since Katrina, the scars still remain, both for those who survived and the nation as a whole. Anytime a hurricane seems to take an aim at New Orleans, people are immediately concerned about the levee system, and for good reason. The deaths of over 1,000 Americans occurred due to poor communication and a lack of preparedness of what to do ahead and after the storm. But I want to make it clear that the failed response to Katrina was not the fault of one singular agency, but rather the failure of all levels of government from nearly all agencies involved. Very few agencies got the storm right, either in the general response to the storm or in forecasting. The United States military, specifically the US Coast Guard, which, to be fair, does well in the aftermath of pretty much any natural disaster, and NOAA. While the forecast before the storm rapidly intensified was incorrect, when the forecast was shifted to the west, the forecast verified with the track of the storm. The messaging from the National Weather Service was clear of what was possible and was adequate. Hurricane Katrina, as a storm, is one that should never be forgotten, as the absolute worst-case scenario for when the flaws of critical infrastructure lead to the worst disasters, and how bad a response to a natural disaster can be with no plan in place. Hurricane Katrina is a storm that the residents of Louisiana and Mississippi will never forget anytime soon, and one that nobody should ever forget, no matter how long it's been since it has occurred. So, this was a long video to make. I guess channel update stuff is in order. As of right now, my living situation is still up in the air, however, I think I can get a smaller video out sometime in the later part of the month, and then proceed with my documentary overview of what I've covered this year alongside corrections. I'll also begin production of a Weather of 2022 in a Nutshell video come January. It will not be in a ton of detail since it'll be covering nearly everything in the world that I found interesting, but I think it's enough to warrant a serious video. It'll also mean that I can say what events I will and won't cover come the end of next year. Special thanks to my proofreaders, which is just Rishi, sorry, and special thanks to Celtic White, who has finished the stills that I commissioned. They turned out amazing and I cannot thank him enough. I recently got approved to have YouTube memberships, and I am planning to ask him to do some emojis and badges that I can use for YouTube memberships. Once that is done, I'm going to shut down the Patreon and transport that over here to YouTube, so I have it all in one place. My Patreon will stay active until sometime in January, though. Speaking of those patrons, special thanks to those subscribed to the channel Patreon. Those being Ace Cooper, Maxwell Looney, and Montpellier at the Elfies Army tier, and Basilius of Stupidonia, King Shisa, Neon Binary, Origin, and Worm Off the String at the Elf Mini tier. If you want to support what I do financially and get access to full uncut interviews and my scripts, consider subscribing to the Patreon, and when YouTube memberships become a thing, that'll also be applied to the YouTube membership deals. Additionally, shout out to Xavier Burns, also known as Phonycom X King, for providing me with the animation track for Hurricane Katrina, along with letting me use his icons. That being said, I know this has been a long one, so I'll end it here. I'm Opharia, hope you all enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video around, all that jazz. You all stay safe out there, and I'll see you all around next time.